Hello everyone and welcome to another middle game episode focusing on the pawn structure with Coach P and masteryourchess.com. In this video we're going to focus on the next weak pawns, which are the doubled pawns and the triple pawns, also called the Irish pawn center. Most players have a mortal fear about acquiring doubled pawns. Now they are most of the times weak, but not always. Sometimes they do have some benefits as well. In this video, however, we are going to focus on them being a weakness and how we can take advantage of them. In this first position, white has doubled pawns on c3 and c4, and definitely the pawn on c4 will be the biggest target just because it will be easier to attack it. Here it's black to move, and he makes the move bishop to a6, immediately putting more pressure on the pawn on c4. He already has the queen and the rook eyeing that pawn. White responds with f4, which actually creates new problems just because the pawn on e4 is weakened. And this game is played by intermediate level players in Class C, however it's very instructive. From here, black replies with knight to a5, again putting pressure on c4 and threatening to capture on the next move. White responds with rook to b4, bringing another defender. Right now, if you look at this position, black is attacking the pawn on c4 with 4 pieces, the knight, bishop, queen, and rook. And now white defends it with 4 pieces, with the knight, bishop, the queen, and also the rook on b4. Black responds with bishop to h6, putting pressure on f4, and also ties the bishop on e3 to its defense. White responds with g3, defending that pawn. And now another excellent move by black, pawn to e5. On the first glance, you might not think that this is a good move, as it creates a backward pawn on d6 and a hull on d5. However, white is not able to take advantage of those weaknesses. Right now, he's on pure defense mode. Just because of all the pawn weaknesses, his pieces need to defend those pawns. What this move does, it puts more pressure on the pawn on f4, threatening to take it, which will open the e-file, creating a new weakness, which is the pawn on e4. White responds with rook to f1, then rook f to e8, and then bishop to d3. Here white noticed the potential threat on the pawn on e4 and comes to its defense. And now black responds with e takes f4, and then bishop takes f4. Black responds with bishop takes f4, g takes f4, and now knight to b7. The black knight switches to go on c5, where he's going to put a lot more pressure on e4 together with the rook. And now white here responds with queen to c2. But coming back, even a more natural move like knight to b3, trying to prevent the knight coming to c5, would not have helped white. Here black would have responded with knight to c5. After knight takes c5, d takes c5, rook to b2, rook c to d8, attacking the bishop, bishop to b1, and f5. After e takes f5, bishop to b7 check, king to g1, and queen to c6. And this game is pretty much over. The threat is queen to h1 checkmate, and if black tries to run away, he's not even going to be able to make it far, because after queen to g2, this is checkmate as well. So coming back, queen to c2 was played, defending e4 again. And from here, I'm just going to fast forward through the game so you can see how black gained an advantage to be able to win the game in the end. Here, white resigned. He's down 2 pawns, and it's going to be extremely difficult to be able to defend against those extra pawns. This next game was played by 2 masters, Alex Kennedy and Edward Lowe, in 1849. And I'm just going to fast forward and stop to comment on the critical moves. This is the position that was reached after 18 moves, and white is in a really bad situation. His pieces aren't doing anything, his king is still in the center, his e pawn is a backward pawn on an open file, and it also kills its own light square bishop. The pawn on c4 is being eyed by the fine knight on e5, and the pawns a3 and c3 are both loose. Here black responds with queen to a5, putting immediate pressure on the pawns on a3 and c3, where one of them will drop. White responds with rook to c2, queen takes a3, castles, and then queen to a4. After winning some material, black is ready to return the queen back to its base, even though a more aggressive play by black here would have been better. Black is happy having that small advantage, and he's just going to retreat and trade his pieces and then use that small advantage to win the game in the end. So I'm just going to fast forward to the move so you could see how that happened. And here, after losing his bishop, white resigned. This next game was played by Federal Master Nigel Fulbrook, rated 2205, versus International Master Jeremy Silman, rated 2355. And again, I'm just going to fast forward through the moves and just stop to comment on the critical moments of the game. And this is the position that was reached after 16 moves. And if we look at this position, we can see that black is clearly better. His knight is very strong on e5, while white's isolated e-pawns can be very easily attacked, either by knight to g4, attacking the pawn on e3, or by a bishop going on to c6 and attacking the e4 pawn. Black's only weakness will remain the pawn on d6, but that pawn can easily be defended. So from here, the game continued with pawn to b5. Black is trying to gain more space on the queen side. Queen to g3, a5, rook to d2, a4, bishop to d1, and then a3. Coming back, bishop to f6 here, it's also a very good move. It puts pressure on h4, which cannot be defended and will be easily taken. However, here black wants to create another weakness. After playing to a3, c3 will become another weakness, and it will be a lot harder for white to defend both threats. From here, the game continued with bishop takes on h5, which is a move played pretty much in desperation. White is trying to do something, as the more he waits, the more pressure black puts on him. Coming back, a more reasonable move here would have been moving the pawn to b3, but after that, the rooks will simply come on the c-file, putting a lot of pressure on c3, which will drop also. So here, white just played very aggressive, trying to weaken the king and hopefully get something out of that. So that's why he came and took on h5. From here, the game continued with g takes h5, knight takes h5, f6, b3, king to h7. And now black is totally safe, and white didn't get enough compensation for the sacrificed piece and later lost the game. So I'm just going to fast forward through the game so you can see how this happened. Here, the queen cannot take on g4, as rook to g8 will simply win the queen. So after king to h2, rook a to g8, it just took a couple of more moves and black was able to checkmate his opponent. And now rook takes g3 is checkmate. This last example I'm going to go over was played by Grandmaster Nigel Short, rated 2674, versus Grandmaster Ivan Sokolov, rated 2685. This is an example we're going to see triple pawns in the game, which the English called the Irish pawn center. So let's go through the move, and again I'm going to stop at the critical moment. And this is the position that was reached after 32 moves, and we could see here that white is clearly better. Even though the material is equal, we could see that white's b3 and c4 pawn is holding the entire Irish pawn center. Even if the b3 pawn will fall, the pawn on c4 is holding all those three pawns, so white is clearly better. The game continued here with rook to d1, rook to f7, rook to d6, rook takes g7, rook d takes e6, rook takes e6, rook takes e6, and then rook to f7. From here, the game is pretty straightforward. White intends to get his king into action so it can help his g-pawn touch down on g8, while black's pawns are not really able to do much. Also, white's rook on f7 is very active. It stops blacks from winning the b3 pawn because after something like rook to e3, that can be met with rook to f3. Also, the rook on f7 creates the f-file into a barrier so that the black king cannot prevent the pawn on the g-file to promote. So I'm going to fast forward through the moves so you could see how the game continued. And now black is up a pawn, however his position is totally helpless. After this, the game concluded in 3 more moves. After king to f8, rook to e3, and rook to f4, black resigned. He was hopeful for a g7 here, where rook to e8 would have been checkmate. Definitely a player at his caliber will not have made that mistake. And after rook to f4, black resigned. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and stay tuned for the next lesson where we're going to take on the weak squares. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.